and I hope that you guys get something new out of my presentation. I'd like to introduce myself. So as Yasmin said, I'm Amy DeRay. I'm with the Maryland Department of Commerce. I work in the Office of Military and Federal Affairs, where my position basically has two functions. The first of which is to do outreach to the federal government, particularly the buying offices and the procurement offices, and making sure that we're doing everything we can in the state of Maryland to make it a rich environment for government suppliers to do their work. And I'm also kind of our business to government, or business to federal government, I should clarify, SME on the staff here at Commerce. I joined Commerce about 2.5 years ago now. But prior to doing that, I had a 20-year career in government contracting. In addition to kind of delivering on contracts, which of course I did in my early years, I left government contracting after 3 years as a VP of operations for a small management consulting and IT firm, where I was responsible for a bunch of different types of operational activities for the business, including our GWAC management and things like compliance and our personnel security and facility security programs. So that's the background I bring to this job. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit about Maryland Department of Commerce, so you have a little bit of context and give you a little taste for some of the programs that we have here. We're going to review the federal procurement landscape in the state of Maryland. And we'll talk a little bit about the business assistance organizations that are available in the state, as well as I'm going to talk to you about the Maryland Defense Network, which is a state-run data tool for those of you who may be interested in doing work, particularly in the DoD sector. I will caveat this by saying that a lot of the information that is on my slides and in my presentation is really rooted in the status quo of federal procurement prior to January 2025. And the subsequent EOs that have kind of reshaped the federal procurement landscape, or are reshaping the federal procurement landscape since their issue. I am going to talk about those EOs a little bit. We'll get to that on slide 7. But I want to say that I'm not an expert, nor do I think anyone is, in how those EOs are going to change the landscape in the near or long term. The Maryland Department of Commerce is one of 20 agencies within Maryland's executive branch, and we are the agency that is largely focused on the business side of economic development. And so we work directly with businesses. We consider businesses our main client, as it were. And so one of the things that we do is we catalyze business across the state, not only through connection, but also through some dedicated programmatic efforts. One of those is leading delegations of Maryland businesses to critical industry trade shows around the globe. We also do a lot of targeted industry ecosystem development, particularly in our key strategic sectors like aerospace, cybersecurity, and life sciences, and advanced manufacturing. And we are also kind of a strategic entity in that we're driving and making policy choices and investment choices in strategic future industries that we're trying to get to. You may have heard yesterday was a big quantum partnership announcement with the University of Maryland and DARPA. That was something that Department of Commerce was involved in from the very get-go. So we tend to make those kind of strategic moves and investments in state industries, depending on what our economic strategy is. And I think one of the most important things we do is we tell the why Maryland story to attract businesses and talent. We can be a resource for you as a business. One of our biggest areas of competency is assisting in building and site location decisions. So if your business is relocating to the state of Maryland, for example, we can help you with determining what's the best place for your business to be located in the state. And in addition, we also provide business assistance in the form of financing, tax credits, and some job training grants to Maryland-based businesses for specific purposes and to help your business grow here in the state. This is a very simplified org chart of our organization, and I want to just point out that Maryland Department of Tourism and the Arts, that's part of the Department of Commerce. But as far as our business attraction and retention efforts are concerned, there's really two main stovepipes. The first is innovation and growth. And you'll see the Office of Military and Federal Affairs. That's where I sit within the organization. So that stovepipe of innovation and growth is really focused on those strategic industries that I talked about in the previous slide, and also in foreign direct investment and international trade, as well as the military and federal ecosystem in the state. And then the other major effort within the department is business attraction and special projects. This is where you get those type of services where we're talking about recruiting major new businesses to the state, the execution of those incentives that we talked about. And where the rubber meets the road, particularly for you as a business, is the regional growth and retention team. And at the end of my slides, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can identify who your regional growth representative is and how you can connect with them to have a discussion about your business and how Maryland might be of assistance to you. So now we're going to transition to talking about the role of federal procurement in the state's economy. This chart comes from a study done in 2024 by Maryland's Office of the Comptroller, where they took a look holistically at the role public procurement plays in Maryland's economy. And you'll see this graph summing up the different elements of procurement. And that green box that you see there, that's $36 million in federal procurement. And then you'll see added to it that the state, the city, the counties, for a total of about $68 billion in procurement. So you'll see that's 14.2% of Maryland's total GDP. So the spending that happens from federal, state, county, and city agencies in the state is a significant portion of our state's economy. That's very large. If I'm not making that point directly, it's of course due in part to our proximity and also to the richness of the federal assets that are in the state. So some more key features that came out of that study. There are three largest federal purchasers in the state are the DoD, HHS, and VA. I don't really think there are any surprises on that list for you. But one of the really rich pieces of information that we got from this study was the second point about our federal vendor presence. So in 2024, our headcount of federal vendors that were doing business with the federal government was that 3,294 firm number that you see there. But that 1,000 number, 1,000 plus, that represents Maryland-based firms that were registered in SAM.gov more than 15 years ago. And when you cross-reference those businesses with their demonstrated procurement revenue from USA spending, you will see year-over-year growth for the past 15 years. So Maryland has really been a fertile ground for businesses who are not only starting to do business with the federal government, but growing their business, using that as a tool to grow their business and their revenue across the state. And when you look at what kind of business is taking place here, so this is when you query the database for place of performance equals Maryland, you'll see that about 3/4 of the 36 billion is taking place in professional services and IT. There's also a significant amount of manufacturing here. 10% of our federal procurement spend is in manufacturing and then construction. So I did mention we were going to talk a little bit about the state of federal procurement, and the only answer I can really give is that it's in flux. But I do want to talk a little bit about the EOs and how that is kind of how that's likely to affect the environment. So the first EO that I'm going to talk about, there's about 5 of them, but I'm going to only talk about these 3 that you have here. So there's procurement consolidation. So many of you are aware that the federal government has for many years, probably about 15 to 20, been trying to go to a category management process, which is a commercial buying process where you group procurements of like type commodities under a single authority or a single contract so that you can then get the data visibility and the ability to really kind of see how you are spending your money and be able to track that directly to a commodity level. This executive order that came out in many ways accelerated that process for the federal government to go to category management, but it also threw out the methods that the government had laid out to get there. So previously, the government was pushing everything to what they would call best-in-class contracts. For IT, that would be like NASA SOUP, or that would be NITAC CIO SP3 or CIO CS type contracts for IT purchases. And what you're seeing that EO do is that's going to have agencies sunset those contracts in favor of standing up additional contract vehicles at the GSA to centralize procurement for those common goods and services. And those categories, as outlined by the EO, are facilities and construction, professional services, IT, like I said, that 3/4 of our federal business, medical, transportation and logistics, industrial products and services, travel, security and protection, human capital, and office management. The second EO that I'm going to talk about is the overhaul of the federal acquisition regulation. And that was an EO that was put out on April 15th. I believe it was called Restoring Common Sense to Federal Procurement. And the purpose of that was to mandate a comprehensive reform of the federal acquisition regulation to cut red tape and improve efficiency. And the EO really did say that the FAR had become an onerous barrier to doing business with the government. And so the goal for that is to make government procurement more agile, effective, and efficient by eliminating unnecessary regulations. And it specifically tied into that a previous EO that many of you may have heard about, that was the 10-for-1 rule. So that EO basically said that you could only put into place one new federal regulation for every 10 that you took away. And so as I'm sure many of you know, the FAR is very complicated, and how they're going to parse that, what does it mean to get rid of 10 regulations in terms of the FAR? I think that's something that's still being worked out, not only in the community, but in the administration. And so I did want to point out that for any of you who have a particular interest or are particularly affected by that FAR overhaul, there is a website that you can go to keep track of kind of the current level of government thinking around that EO, and that is acquisition.gov/FAR-overhaul. Again, that's acquisition.gov/FAR-overhaul. And then finally, the Defense Acquisition Reform EO really took a look at major defense acquisition programs, or MDAPs, and it really targets all of the MDAPs for review. And so what you're seeing right now going on at the Department of Defense is really a bit of a fire drill around analysis, attempting to understand where those programs are and if they meet certain thresholds for being de-scoped or even removed entirely. So I really don't want to belabor this point, but I think it does make the point that things are much in transition at the federal level around federal procurement. And so continue to watch the environment. Like I said, acquisition.gov is a good place to get that information. But I also would like to direct everyone, if you have questions about how things are going to affect your industry in particular, to reach out to your kind of trade organizations, things like AFCEA, or in the professional services side, certainly the Professional Services Council. They have large teams that are working on how these policies are likely to roll out across the industry. So I'm going to show a couple of snapshots here that are going to give you an idea for the reason why Maryland's economic engine is so strong around federal procurement. And this first slide is a synopsis of the 2023 economic impact study that the state did for Maryland's military installations. Maryland has 20 military installations, but we highlight 12 major military installations here on this slide. And so you'll see in those white boxes and you'll have the opportunity to look at this at your leisure, just how much of an economic impact those installations are having in those local areas. Similarly, we have a very, very large federal agency presence. At this census, which was done last fall, there were 57 activities that were taking place here in the local area. Note here that there's a huge HHS presence, of course, headquartered. CMS headquarters is here. NIH, of course, also headquartered in Montgomery County, as well as some other sizable other activities that you'll find in that 270 corridor, like SAMHSA and AHRQ and HRSA. Also notice there's a large Department of Commerce presence, mostly centered around the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also on the I-70 corridor, as well as a number of NOAA facilities that are kind of along the Beltway in the Greenbelt, Riverdale Park area on the north side of the Capitol. We also have a significant amount of Department of Homeland Security activities here in the state. And then finally, just to kind of give you an idea, this map comes from usaspending.gov, and this is basically a heat map that talks about where that place of performance is across the state. And you'll see, again, that deep concentration of federal spending in what I would call the Capitol Corridor area between basically along the I-95 corridor here in the state. Our top 5 counties in the state for federal procurement dollars are Montgomery County in the dark green at 30.1 billion. Second is Prince George's County at 10.3 billion. Third, Howard County at 9.2 billion. Fourth, Anne Arundel County at 8.8 billion. And fifth is Baltimore County at 8.2 billion. On the next series of slides, we're going to talk about those major purchasers, and I'll give you a little bit of an idea about some of the documents and the resources that you can find out more additional information about these. So first up is the Department of Defense is our largest spender here in the state. 18.4 billion for FY 2024. And 74,000 contract awards in total in 2024, as summarized by usaspending.gov. That percent in-house figure that you're going to see on this next series of slides, I want to point out, is how much of that spend and those contract actions are being done by DoD contracting offices. So across the federal government, in part because of category management, several agencies have authorities to use other agencies to write their contracts for them. So if, for example, a purchaser was going to use NITAC, for example, to do a large computer buy, that would be considered something that's not in-house, right? Unless that agency was also HHS. So 95% is actually fairly low among the agencies that are in the state. So I just point that out because it's an interesting feature of how the landscape works. And again, it's one of those things that's likely to change as we see that consolidation of large purchases being driven to GSA by the new administration. Listed here, you'll also see the top 10 NAICS codes from FY 2020 to FY 2024. Yeah. I want to point out that top NAICS code 541715 R&D in the physical engineering and life sciences, that's a bit of an outlier for what we're used to seeing traditionally in the state of Maryland, but that is really reflective of the spending that was done by DoD in support of broad COVID-19 vaccine efforts in FYs 2020 and 2021. On the bottom here, you'll see also what you're going to see on the remainder of the slides, a number of links. And as Yasmin said, you will be receiving these so you can you don't have to take notes here. You can actually get this from the document that you're going to be receiving. But one of the things I always like to share with people I work with, understanding the agencies, looking at the agency's website, understanding what their strategy is and what direction they're headed, and how they're likely to support that through outside efforts, particularly if you're a professional services provider. Many agencies will use vendor databases. In this case, DoD does not have a single database. It will depend on the type of product and the sub-agency that's purchasing it. Also, there is no single contracting office website. And but you will see here links to small business programs, not just the DoD small business program, but also a link to the small business programs at the military departments and sub-agencies. I will also point out that they do have an acquisition forecast tool at the DoD level. Of course, DoD is very difficult to summarize on a single slide. That's one of the reasons why we commissioned the Maryland Defense Network tool. We're going to talk about that at the end of the presentation today. I also want to draw your attention to the charts on the right side of the slide. So these come directly from SBA's small business subcontract or small business scorecards that each of the agencies have. And I always like to direct everyone's attention to this so you can see, particularly if you're a small business, how the agency is doing in meeting its small business goals. So if you look at the top chart, you'll see that the goal is the red rectangle and the achievement for that goal is the blue rectangle. So if you were to look at this in the aggregate for small business, DoD is meeting its goal, or at least it did in 2023. But you can look across to those socioeconomic categories, and you can see where are those places where the agency made a goal, but they fell short. And so I like to point that out because if your business does have or carry one of those socioeconomic categories, that can be a really great place for you to get an idea of which agencies need support from businesses like yours. Because I've talked to many, many small business offices across the services, and they are very serious about meeting these goals. Now, I will also mention that small business goals have been somewhat in flux with the new administration. So these, like I said, do reflect 2023, but we are still, of course, waiting to see how changes in how the federal government does business really impacts how that strategy plays out. Our second large purchaser here in the state, Department of Health and Human Services. Again, you're going to see that same bump in the 541715 NAICS code that we saw on the DoD slide. I also want to point out on this slide that HHS does have a consolidated vendor database. It's a newish vendor database. It stood up about 2.5 years ago. However, if you were one of the early adopters of HHS's customer experience portal for small businesses, I would invite you to kind of go back to that directory and take a look again at your profile. I know that approximately back in October, November of 2024, the agency did kind of a 2.0 release of that vendor portal. And as a result, there were a lot more data fields that businesses could self-populate in order to make themselves more visible on keyword searches. And so if you have been away from that tool for any length of time, I would encourage you to go back to that tool and make sure that your profile is really as robust as it can be as you, if you are interested in doing business with any of the HHS sub-agencies. I also want to point out for the Department of Health and Human Services that they are consistently recognized across the industry as having a very strong accuracy and fidelity in their contract forecast. So for those of you who may not know what a contracting forecast is, every organization in the federal government is expected to put out a 12-month forecast of its upcoming contract actions and what the acquisition strategies are for those. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the contract forecast. Now, kind of directing our attention to that kind of small business achievement chart, you'll see while HHS, again, very strong, look, very tall goal, much taller in percent of goal in 2023 than the DoD, you'll see that by and large, they are meeting those goals, but for example, service disabled veteran owned, there was a small shortfall, as well as hub zone, there was a small shortfall. To talk a little bit to that small business subcontracting achievement, you'll see that they did not make their goal. And I want to point out that the difference between these two charts is really that in the case of the second chart, many large contracts will have small business subcontracting goals that they write into those contracts. And so the prime vendor, when they win the contract, is expected throughout the life of the contract to direct a portion of the revenue at whatever stated goal that is to small businesses that are subcontracted to that prime vendor. And so you'll see that one of the challenges that HHS faced in 2023 was actually meeting that small business subcontracting goal. And I would like to mention that you can find those subcontracting plans for those contracts that require subcontracting goals on SBA's website. That's a great place for you to go if you are interested in perhaps joining a prime contracting team that's already delivering on contract services. You can go to SBA's website and see which contracts have been written that have it in the management plan that they have a small business goal. Our third largest spender here in the state is the Department of Veterans Affairs. Again, you'll see almost $700 million in contracts and 1,396 awards in FY24, and largely doing that contracting in-house. I want to point out that many people are unaware, but the VA does have a strategic purchasing entity. That was its primary driver for making the agency compliant with category management practices. And they operate out of a facility in Frederick, Maryland. A large component of that kind of strategic purchasing for the VA is their own schedule system. So you'll see if you see under vendor database, the VA has a supply schedule that they have pre-priced and pre-vetted vendors, similar to what GSA has. And so that's your primary mechanism for getting on the vendor database at the Veterans Affairs Department. You'll see also in their small business achievement how, again, they have a robust goal, which they are meeting. You'll see that they have a very strong preference and mandate for purchasing from service disabled veteran owned businesses. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anyone. But again, that kind of small business subcontracting achievement does fall short for the agency. So again, that's an opportunity for small businesses to kind of connect with prime vendors who are already contract holders who may be having difficulty meeting their contract goals. I also want to point out on this slide the contracting forecast link that you see at the very bottom. Acquisition Gateway is an effort of the broader federal government to consolidate those agency forecasts into a single portal. And so the VA does publish its forecast on that portal. Not all agencies do, as we've just described. You know, at HHS, they have their own portal. DoD does something very different. Another large entity in the state that does a lot of contracting is the Social Security Administration. Now, I want to point out two things on the top line here. First, that $400 billion Social Security spend is very difficult to kind of parse through, in part because it contains so much direct payments, and that kind of muddies the water around the spending data that you see in USA Spend. But it was a significant purchaser or contracting entity with 1,381 contracts awarded in FY23. And you can see much of what they buy is around computers and software and telecommunications, which I don't think is really a surprise for an agency that operates in a very dispersed manner, right? They have call centers, they have offices that you can visit in out there in every community across the United States. And so I think their top 10 NAICS codes are probably no surprise to anybody. I will mention that their vendor database is not something you can self-submit to, but you can submit your profile documents to this email address, vendor repository at ssa.gov, to be added to their vendor database that they keep internally. But it is not the kind of thing as you would see in HHS where you as a vendor go in and create a profile for your business. It's something that's completely done in-house. As a standalone organization, SSA does have a scorecard on sba.gov, which is why you see those charts represented on the left side of the slide. And you'll see that, again, they have a robust small business goals, and in large part are also meeting them with the exception of the SDVOSB and the hub zone businesses. But there is somewhat of a shortfall in their their small business subcontracting. Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, also located in the Woodlawn area. They are a sub agency to the Department of Health and Human Services, but they again have a huge spending profile, largely in part because they do a lot of contracting with health care providers and health insurance providers and all those kind of ancillary health services. You'll notice that this chart, they don't have any bar graphs because they don't have their own SBA scorecard. Their data gets rolled up into HHS's scorecard. I want to point out that I don't have a current date for Industry Day, but typically they do run a very extensive Industry Day event in December of every year. It's typically the second week of December. So I would expect that to take place. It's in person. It takes place on the CMS campus in Woodlawn. And it's really a great event they bring a lot of procurement officers together from all over the agency to talk about the upcoming year and also changes in how they do business. It's really a great place to go and get some insight into how the government does procurement. I also want to point out, and I will have linked here for you in the handout, that there was last July a reverse industry day that was co-hosted by NCMA, the Woodlawn chapter, as well as Professional Services Council. And a reverse industry day is really an opportunity for industry leaders. In this case, it was primes and that did business with CMS to basically talk to the government about their pain points in not only contracting, but also contracted delivery of services. And that I point out and I provide as a link here, because if you have any interest in kind of the sausage making around how big companies, prime companies, are thinking strategically about their business development pipelines and how to capture business, as well as the ins and outs of just how complex some of those large professional services contracts can be, I think it's a really great look into all of that. It really did open my eyes in particular to some of the complexities and the challenges that the agency has. I also want to point out on this slide that CMS as an HHS entity does use SBCX, or HHS's Small Business Customer Experience Portal that we talked about on the previous slide with HHS. So if you submit to that vendor database for HHS, you're also getting visibility in CMS if CMS is one of your target customers. I've listed here for 22 to 24 the top 5 contract recipients from CMS, where the period of performance, or I'm sorry, the place of performance was Maryland. So you can take a look at the companies that are getting that Maryland business on the prime side. I also point out the top 5 small business contractors here. And the reason I point out both is because I want everyone to leave with the understanding that it's not always a large that partners with a small. A lot of times smalls partner with each other and they can be very competitive in that space. And so I remember my time in small business, we did have a number of small business companies that we would also partner with to deliver a team of services, to really showcase the strength across three or maybe even four businesses to be a competitor in a large procurement. NASA Goddard Space Flight Center is going to be the last entity that I do a deep dive in today for everybody. But I do want to assure you that we have profiles similar to these on our Maryland Commerce website and in our presentation that you're going to receive today. If you go to the very last slide, there'll be a link that'll take you to the repository for all the profiles for the organizations in the state. Even our tiny little federal prison out in Western Maryland, you'll find a federal profile for that. NASA Goddard does a lot of centralized procurement, but they do have procurement representatives at each flight center and each science center. Our Goddard Space Flight Center is largely a science center. It does a lot of its business in the science space. However, there are some mission, and so engineering and construction and satellite integration that takes place at Goddard, particularly as it supports NOAA, which is, of course, right in the neighborhood. You'll see that the vendor engagement event box here is blank, but I did want to point out to everybody that NASA events are ticketed by Eventbrite. And so if NASA happens to be one of your target customers, you can go to Eventbrite and look for NASA and subscribe to their ticket issuance. And so, for example, I went there today and I noted that NASA Goddard Office of Small Business is having a Meet the Prime event tomorrow. So I suggest that if, again, NASA is one of your customers, you go to Eventbrite, you follow that organizer. And what's great about Eventbrite is it also will show you similar organizers. And I know that NASA is not the only one out there in the Eventbrite ecosystem putting out small business events. You'll see that there is a NASA vendor database, not unlike the HHS database, where you can submit your company profile. There's also a robust contracting office website, and they do a lot of engagement. Just recently, NASA were a huge piece of the government procurement conference that took place in April down in Washington, D.C. at the Walter Washington Convention Center. NASA had its own track. So they are out there doing vendor engagement events, but they tend to be a little bit more difficult to find. So again, I invite you to kind of go to that small business office website, and you'll see some events posted around their small business office that will be helpful to you in getting connected with NASA Goddard vendors. The only other thing I want to point out on this slide before I move away is just how successful the small businesses are in the NASA space. So you'll see our top 5 contract recipients. You'll see analytical mechanics associates on here both times. So the top small business contractor actually broke into the top actual contractor, right? Which I think is a great success story and really shows the work that NASA Goddard is doing in the small business space to try to make their small businesses a huge part of what they do there at the center. I always like to share with folks that Maryland has a great business assistance organization ecosystem. So I'm sure that many organizations on this slide you are probably familiar with, particularly on the top half of the slide. All those entities are here doing great work in the state and really providing excellent opportunities for businesses to connect not only with each other, but with expertise across the state. I do want to highlight a couple of those on the bottom of the slide. So for those of you who may not be aware, I will point out Medco and TEDCO. So Medco is the Maryland Economic Development Corporation. They differ from what we do at Commerce in large part because they take on large, mostly real estate development projects. But they also have some really great business outreach partnerships with a lot of our federal agencies. So Um, they are in a memorandum of understanding with NASA Goddard to do business outreach for them, as well as the Army Research Laboratory to do some outreach for them. So Medco is a very unique organization. And while it's completely off topic, it's very fascinating, and I'm happy to talk about Medco at any time. I also want to point out TEDCO. So TEDCO is our Technology Economic Development Corporation. They operate like a venture capital fund here in the state, but they also do a lot of work and have a very large federal buying practice within TEDCO. And that practice really focuses on things like small business innovation research and small uh, science and technology transfer. So if that describes your business, or if you are a business that does a lot of R&D and are interested in accessing federal government technologies and perhaps driving them to commercialization for a government client, they are a great asset that you can leverage to get access to that. In particular, they have a program called the Def Tech program, which focuses specifically on defense laboratories. And I'm sure you're probably aware, but a lot of the defense activity that takes place in the state is around research and development. Particularly at Aberdeen Proving Ground, you have DevCom, which is the um, activity for the Army that does all soldier technology. So if it's a wearable device or a piece of body armor, it's being developed and proven at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Similarly, if it's a medical technology or a device or a protocol, it's being tested at Fort Detrick. So we have a very robust defense laboratory ecosystem here in the state. And so if that's something that interests you, TEDCO is really going to be a great asset for you. And for those of you who are veteran-owned businesses, I also would direct you to the Veteran Institute for Procurement. They do an excellent training program, and they are operated out of the, in part through partnership with Montgomery County Chamber. So the business associations, I always like to point out Maryland Tech Council with its 5 chapters across the state. It can be, they are technology agnostic, so it doesn't matter what kind of tech you are. They are an organization that looks to promote and promote technology development here in the state. I also want to point out the Montgomery County Chamber, the Howard County Chamber, and the Central Maryland Chambers of Commerce. Those are 3 chambers that have a dedicated government contracting business committee. So they offer specific programming and training specifically for federal government contractors. Montgomery County Chamber has also had a longstanding partnership with HHS and has a rich history of delivering industry engagement events on behalf of HHS. And then, of course, we have a great number of trade associations that live in Maryland as well, like AFCEA and CAMI. So for those of you who are kind of in the IT or cyberspace, those would be great options for you, but they're not the only ones out there. But I bring them up as an example of the kinds of things that are available here in the state. And finally, I want to mention the Mead Business Connect Council, which is a small council that sits within the Fort Meade Alliance. So if your business area is in cybersecurity or defense information systems or any of those activities that grow out of Fort Meade, Mead Business Connect does a great series of webinars. They do 2 seminars every year that are half days, really deep diving on relevant issues, particularly for those who are interested in doing business in that defense and intelligence space. Just recently, last week, they did a deep dive into how the government evaluates professional compensation, which is a new element of the FAR that required contracting offices to really look into how businesses compensate the personnel that are going to sit embedded in a government organization as a contractor. And so that was really a great event. And in addition, if you are a business in that space and you have your security clearance, they also have a micro mentorship cohort program that meets 10 months of the year. So that cohort is forming now to start in September. And those are really great small, like 12 to 18 businesses that go from prime to prime to prime across that ecosystem and really learn deep into how to do business, how to bid work in that space. And they often realize partnerships with those primes. Two other things I just want to mention here because I don't hear them enough in and around the government contracting landscape are a couple of new approaches that were on the rise. Again, in the status quo prior to January. I'm not really sure how these are going to be affected by EOs, but these are some approaches to getting federal revenue you may not be aware of. The first is the Unison Marketplace, which is an online platform that streamlines procurement for government buyers by providing access to sellers. And basically, this is a worldwide network that basically is like an eBay for federal contracting. It's a very unique approach. So you as a vendor, you get a look at a bid and you make a bid that's basically like where I want to go, and then kind of your lowest, this is the lowest I can do it and still make a profit, right? And you're able to kind of set what those levels are, and then at a certain point it goes into a reverse auction. And so based upon the parameters set by the purchaser, it'll surface whichever is the best price the government will be able to access for that service. So that's something that's very unique. Often on that platform, you'll see things that the government has had a difficult time trying to procure through other methods, and it can be a very short turnaround in terms of revenue, often leading to a contract in 3 to 4 weeks. So particularly if you are a seller in the marketplace and you are a product-based company, that might be someplace that you would want to take a look to see if that's something that you can leverage to generate some revenue. And secondly, I want to point out Sourcewell. The Department of the Army recently entered into an intergovernmental support agreement with the state of Minnesota. And Sourcewell is basically Minnesota's equivalent of the GSA. And so this intergovernmental service agreement was for what they would call municipal services. So anything you would think a city would actually deliver on behalf of its citizens. So road construction, snow removal, small construction projects, things of that nature. And through that partnership, military or installations are now able to go to Sourcewell as their contracting activity to get those types of services accomplished for them on those installations. It is very much a scheduled process like GSA. So if you apply to be a vendor through Sourcewell, you'll go through a vetting process and your services will be pre-priced. But that can be another avenue for you that's a little bit out of the box for identifying places where you might be able to do work, particularly on military installations in the state. I notice I'm coming close to time, so I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, but I don't think it's any surprise that AI is making its way into how the government does business. And so it's always very, very much more important than it ever has been before that you make sure that your DSBS and SAM profiles are as accurate and robust as possible. So also, if you have a capability statement that's out there on the web, making sure that that capability statement is readable text for AI and it's not just an image. Those are the kind of things that particularly as a small business, if you're looking to get noticed and found through the RFI process and the market research process, those are just good steps that you need to take and do it regularly and refresh that information. I can't tell you how many times I go and I look up a DSBS profile for a business and their past performance that they list there is like 12 or 15 years old. Like these are just the kind of things that you can do to make sure that you as a seller to the government are as visible and as up to date in your digital presence as far as the government's concerned. I'm going to just briefly touch on the Maryland Defense Network. Again, I said DoD is a huge agency and very complex. And so one of the tools that are available to you as a Maryland business is to go and register for this Maryland Defense Network. You will have to register and get a password and an ID, but it is free for you to use. And it is basically, I'm going to show you a couple of reports that you're able to generate on MDN that may give you some visibility and help you with your business development research. Also want to point out that there is a companion LinkedIn group. So please do, when you get the slides, navigate to that LinkedIn group and sign up to be part of that discussion. So I'm going to show you two different reports. There are several available on MDN, but in this particular report, you'll see this is an expiring contracts report that I generated for Joint Base Andrews. So you'll see my previous business, we were in professional services. So that industry sector 54, I've selected that as my filter. And my slider, I've indicated there that I'm going to try to capture everything contracts expiring within 180 days. So when you run this report specific to an installation, you'll get a list of what those contracts are that are expiring in 180 days. And as I'm sure you know, particularly with ongoing services, those contracts are likely to be rebid in the next 6 months. So that's a great way for you to identify contracting opportunities that may be coming down the line that fit with your business. Similarly, if you're looking to do teaming for different contract actions, you can do a top vendors report. And again, you'll select the fiscal year and the location that you're looking to work. And you'll see, based upon the obligated dollars value, which are the big businesses or prime vendors that are doing the most business at those installations. So you can target your outreach. Finally, I want to point out, I'm sure you're familiar with Maryland Business Express, but if you're ever looking for an expanded catalog of resources around government contracting, or even looking to access information about Maryland state and local government contracting, if you go to Maryland Business Express and you toggle over this grow card, it'll expand to what you see in the red, and then you can hover over government contracting and click it, and it'll take you to a lot of the resources that you've seen linked here. Finally, I'm going to put a little plug in for the Maryland Defense Forum, which is this is our second running of this conference. It happens every 2 years, and the intent is to bring Maryland military installations and partner organizations together to include like their small business offices and industry resources to one spot, and that will take place June 17th and June 18th at the Hilton BWI Airport. And you'll see, again, you'll have this to go find, but also QR code is provided for your quick getting onto that site if you're interested. Finally, this is how you can get a hold of me. Again, I'm Amy DeRay. You can reach me at amy.deray@maryland.gov. I do manage a link tree for myself, so I keep relevant government resources there. So that might be something you want to subscribe to. In addition, I put out a monthly newsletter. It comes out the first Monday of every month, and you may navigate to that QR code to sign up for that. It goes out via MailChimp. And then again, if you'll recall way back at the beginning of the presentation, I talked to you about your regional economic development person, and this QR code is where you can go find out exactly, based on where your business is headquartered, who you want to reach out to in order to start having those conversations. If you think that there's a loan program maybe, or a tax incentive, or even if you need some job training assistance, we may be able to help you. So please do visit that site and make a connection with your regional economic development representative. And that concludes the formal part of my presentation. And I'm glad that we have about 5 minutes for questions and answers. So I will turn it over to Yasmin to see if there's anything anybody has that I might be able to answer.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was indeed a great deep dive. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot today. So yeah, if you have any questions for Amy, type them in the chat box, or if you'd like her to explain anything that she mentioned earlier in the presentation. So here's a question. Is it possible to see if the expiring contracts are moved to a set aside, such as EDWOSB?
So our tool does not give that kind of visibility, but I think the questioner is really onto a really great best practice for government contracting for small businesses, right? One of the reasons why you want to be on the lookout for that expiring contract is so that you can bring and flag those types of expiring contracts to the small business offices so that they can add it to their acquisition strategy, that those go to small socioeconomic disadvantaged businesses. And it's really great if you also have a competitor business that you're familiar with, that you can bring two of you to that conversation, right? But right now, that is not a functionality for the Maryland Defense Network, but I will definitely take that down as a great idea.
Okay, that's great. Well, it doesn't look like there are any other questions, just a lot of people saying thank you and that this was a great session. And I thoroughly agree. So we do appreciate having you. I think this is the first time you've taught an outreach event like this for us. So we appreciate it and hope to bring you back again in the future. I am going to be sending out the recording and the presentation with all these great links. So look out for that in your inbox. So I'd like to thank Amy again for spending time putting all this together. And I know she was updating it to the last minute to make sure you had the most recent information. So again, we do appreciate it. And we hope to see you all at a future Apex Accelerator event. And Amy, if anybody has any questions afterwards, are they okay to email you about that?
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, wonderful. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Take care. See you soon.